I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do. So, here we are again, and we get to interview Eric today. Steve, can you share with us a little bit about our guest, Eric?
And we are deliberately only using his first name today, but Eric was born and raised in Damascus, Oregon. He became a Christian while attending Oregon State University, and after he finished at university, he went to Mongolia for a year, returned to the U.S., and pursued a master's in theology at Dallas Theological Seminary. While at seminary, Eric met his wife, Pauline, who was also a student, and after completing their seminary studies, Eric and Pauline moved to Canada, where Eric completed his Ph.D., and God blessed them with two wonderful daughters. In 2016, Eric and Pauline joined the mission organization they're currently with. They moved to South Asia to teach at a seminary and to train future pastors, evangelists, and church planners. And since 2020, Eric and Pauline have served as the Southeast Asia regional directors for their mission, and they oversee 30 missionaries in 6 countries.
Yeah, so today we are going to talk with Eric about global view of missions today. Thanks for joining us.
Looking forward to it. Well, this morning on the Innkeepers podcast, we're interviewing Eric, and we're talking about the topic of global missions today. So, Eric, please introduce yourself and share a little bit about your ministry.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real joy to be here. So I'll just tell you just shortly a little bit about myself. I became a Christian in Oregon at Oregon State University back in 1994. So for those listeners from Oregon, that's great. I started doing some short-term mission trips a few years later. In 97. Went on a short-term mission trip to Utah and was doing some evangelization out there. And then that summer I did a 10-week mission trip to Mongolia, and then had an opportunity to go back to Mongolia again the next summer in 98. And then when I graduated from Oregon State, I moved to Mongolia for a year, and that was, I think, a transitional, pivotal point in my life and in my ministry. I was there alone. I was working as a tent-making missionary. I lived with a Mongolian family, so it was a very immersive experience. While I was there, I met a guy from a seminary. I didn't know what a seminary was because I'd only been a Christian for a few years. And so he tempted me to come back and go to Dallas, just a seminary, and I got hooked up at Dallas Theological Seminary and moved down there. And that's where I met my wife. And she was a student also at the same time. Then after that, we moved to Canada. We lived in Canada for 5 years. I did my doctoral studies there. And then we came back to the US, and I was an associate pastor for a while. And then about 2015-ish, God laid it on our heart to come to India and, for me to use my theological education to help train leaders here in India. So we joined a mission agency in Kansas City called Avant Ministries. They've been around for a long time. They used to be known as Gospel Missionary Union. It's a church planting mission mostly, but we have people that do a variety of things. I do theological education mostly. And so we moved here. We worked in Bangalore for a while, worked in the Philippines for a while. Now we're at a different part of India. And we, about 4 years ago, took on the role of regional directors. And so we oversee 30 missionaries in Southeast Asia in 6 other countries, which is probably the highlight of my job. I like teaching, but I like working with our people throughout Southeast Asia the most.
Great. Thanks for sharing, giving that big picture and just kind of how you got your introduction into the world of missions. And it's kind of
Yeah.
cool that it came pretty early for you with, you became a Christian and then it's like, go out and start telling people. So that's
Yeah, and I wasn't super excited about it. I mean, I don't want to get off on this, but a part of my journey was I was not interested at all in being a missionary. I was an academic,
Yeah.
and God just kind of changed it. And yeah, I mean, so I kind of came to the mission field kicking and screaming in a way.
Yeah. Well, God can use all of us, that's for sure.
He definitely can.
Yeah. So as we get into this topic of what global mission looks like, let's step back and look at what do you think it looked like 30 to 50 years ago? What was being a missionary like back then?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, so much has changed. I think there's practical things that have changed that may not seem like a big deal, when we're back in our home countries, but when we're on the field, they make a big difference. And the big one is globalization, and technology has changed the world. The 1990s, early 2000s, like China entered the World Trade Organization. Well, this radically changed the world. So, we have Korean air conditioners and, like it's just the world's all interconnected. And this actually changes how ministry happens, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But I think 50 years ago, life was just a lot harder on the mission field. I mean, it's still difficult in some ways, but it's not nearly as hard as a generation or two ago. We have cars, we have mobile phones, we have the internet, we have international restaurants in most of the major metropolitan cities of the world. Air travel's pretty safe and reliable. Public transportation. So I mean, life is just different. It's easier, which you would think should make missions work easier. But again, we'll talk about some of the challenges we faced recruiting people. I think 50 years ago, missionaries were less connected to each other in their home office. So we missionaries had to be more independent because of the communication and less travel options. So there was a lot more, like you just had to have more grit. And that, I think people that were determined came to the field and stayed on the field. And it was probably in some ways harder to leave the field too, but
Yeah.
yeah.
There's the whole, take your casket with you kind of thing that happened in the 1900s.
Yeah, I mean, it's really true. Like I don't know the exact numbers, but our retention rate of missionaries is it's pretty bad. And I think some of it has to do with the ease of quitting. I mean, it's pretty easy to quit and to stop. So, I mean, it's some other things that have changed. I think the expectations for missionaries before they go to the field has changed. Back a generation ago, it was not uncommon for you to go to training in your agency for a month or 2 months or 6 months or a year. And some agencies still do that, but that's really uncommon now. I mean, even in our agency, I think we used to have like a 2-month long training, and now it's 2 weeks. So wow. The amount of preparation time is much less. Also, the expectations for education of missionaries is different. A lot of agencies used to require you to have a MDiv or something like that, and most of those requirements have been dropped now in our day. So the nature of the kind of people we're sending is different. They aren't as well trained. They don't quite have the same background skills as a few generations ago. Language obviously is different. Like English is just so much more prevalent in the world than it was 50 years ago. The other thing I think related to sort of technology, but the bigger part of that is globalization. The world is homogenous in a way that it never has been. Until you go back to ancient Mediterranean Greek speaking, when everybody had similar culture. But like we watched the Squid Games in the US, right? This Korean television show. A couple of years ago, I was here in India and everybody's watching Game of Thrones, right? And so when a movie comes out in the US, it comes out here at the same time. People are watching Bollywood movies. I was just in Egypt recently, and the taxi driver said one of his favorite things to do was watch Bollywood movies. So we live in a world that linguistically is more homogenous. A lot of people are speaking English, but then English has picked up other words from other languages, and culturally is becoming homogenous, right? Everybody's on TikTok, everybody's on Instagram, everybody's watching the same TV shows. So this opens up opportunities actually for ministry, because one of the barriers to doing ministry is forming connections with people. And if you can go into a culture and find out you have shared connections, like you all like watching Bollywood movies, it's much easier to do that now, right? There's the possibility of shared connection. Right. Yeah, there's much more common ground. Yeah. The other big thing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
No. I just think in the 40s and 50s, there was quite a surge of mission activity, people going to the field.
Yes.
And those are the people that have retired now. But
yes.
What does it look like in numbers now compared to?
Yeah. So from the 1970s, I'd have to go back again and look. The 1950s, I don't have off the top of my head, but from the 1970s, I feel like maybe around, I want to say 400,000, but that feels too high. There's about 400,000 missionaries today, but only about 200,000 of them are from the West, or what we call the global North now.
Okay.
So, just slightly over 50%, about 53%. Back in 1970, 88% of all missionaries were from the West. Now the numbers are hard to add up, because we're able to send more people now because we have more money and stuff like that. So there might have been 200,000 Western missionaries back in the 1970s, but we should have, the population was half as much as it is today. I mean, back in 1970s, there's only 4 million people in the world, or back in the 1950s, 4 billion people in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the percentages have shifted. The numbers have increased, but the percentages aren't necessarily shifting.
The number of actual Western missionaries might be roughly the same as what it was in the 1970s, but it should be twice as much, or, it just hasn't grown with the population.
Yeah.
It's actually declining in the West. And we can talk more about that later too.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your organization and their efforts in training and sending non-Western missionaries?
Yeah. So that's obviously a big shift that's taken place really in the last generation. And our agency, Avant, is not the only one. Lots of other agencies have started offices in other countries. We have an office in Guatemala. We have a pretty robust recruitment effort in Latin America. We're hoping to start one in Brazil here before too long. But like in my region, I oversee people from 10 different countries. And we have half of those countries. Now, most of our number of missionaries in my region are North American, but half of the countries are Latin American countries. So that's a big change that's taken place. The countries that we were sending missionaries to a generation or two ago, in the 1950s, right? We were sending missionaries to Ecuador and Honduras and these countries. Now we have people going out from those countries to evangelize the rest of the world. I have a nice lady that works with us in Brazil. She's from kind of a more tribal part of Ecuador, and which is just super cool, because our agency was one of the first people going into some of these tribal regions in Ecuador, back in the day, back in the 1950s. And now to see the fruit of that labor 70 years later, those churches in those tribal communities are sending missionaries out to Asia and other parts of the world. And I think that's the success story of 20th century missions.
That we're seeing the fruit of the last generation
Absolutely.
work.
Yeah, we're seeing, and there's so many ways of looking at it. I mean, I could probably go on and on for the rest of our time together talking about ways we see that fruit. I was in the Philippines a few months back talking with a guy about missionary, having foreign missionaries coming in, and he was a Filipino, and he looked at me very directly and he said, why are you wanting to send Filipinos or foreign missionaries here to the Philippines? Because there's very few unreached people groups left in the Philippines. And most of the people doing the evangelism are Filipinos. The Filipino church is entirely self-supporting financially. They have their own seminaries. They have their own training institutes. They're doing it. The Filipinos are doing it.
That's awesome.
And that's an amazing success story.
So, as missions has shifted, what are some of the challenges and areas of need that you're seeing in missions today?
Yeah. So since we're talking about sending missionaries from the global South, let me start there because they face certain challenges, and one of those challenges is funding. Right? That they're still coming from, like Honduras is like a depressed economy in a lot serious ways. Ecuador has good churches. It's got some money, but it's still hard. Like fundraising in these countries is still very difficult. So one of the challenges for our workers from the global South is finding funding. Now it gets complicated because one of our temptations is to divert, funds from richer countries to poorer countries, and certainly we can do that, and some people do, but that brings its own host of problems with it. So solving the funding problem, I think, is one of the challenges, the biggest challenges that faces missions right now. Yeah, another thing along that same line is finding places for people from the global South to go. We have a recruitment officer in Argentina who does recruitment for us. And he said to me a couple of years ago, he said, I have 1,000 young people, young Argentines who feel God's call to do cross-cultural missions. We just don't have anywhere to send them because they don't have any networks built up. Right? Yeah, they actually tried sending an Argentine couple to somewhere in the Middle East, and it didn't work because there was no network. They had no connections. There was no way for them to get on. They actually sent them, but they didn't know anybody in that city. So it's just super, super difficult because they don't have any network on the ground for them to connect to. So one of the things we're starting to see is these international mission networks of cooperation where people will send missionaries and another mission agency has an opportunity for them to serve. And I think that's an area where we've seen a lot of improvement is in collaboration between mission agencies. And another challenge is, sorry, go ahead, Kara.
Yeah, so just this idea of that maybe where they're headed, some other organization has some sort of inroads and some sort of connection, and then plugging in and having that partnership ends up being more effective.
That's right. So I was in touch with a team down in Mindanao, the southern island, southern area of the Philippines, and there was a team predominantly with another mission agency. And I said, hey, we've got this family. They might be interested in coming down there and working. Would you be interested in having them? And of course, there was hoops we had to jump through and, official stuff, but they were very happy to take them. They were very excited. They brought a skill set that the team needed. And we see a lot more of that today, I think, than we did a generation or two ago. A lot more of that kind of collaboration.
So then you end up with very multinational teams too.
Yes.
So that's got to be a huge difference as well for the shift of not only is it globalization, but within the teams we're seeing so much more diversity itself.
Right. And that's certainly true. It's not uncommon now for mission agencies to have multinational teams, multi-ethnic teams. And that in itself is one of the challenges. Like we have a team in Spain, Avant does, and it's a very, very multinational team. We've got people from all over the world working at this media center. and they had to figure out what language are they going to have all of their business meetings in, and they chose Spanish because it's in Malaga, Spain. But that means everybody that comes there has to learn Spanish well enough to conduct the business meetings, and then you're having to deal with cultural differences, right? How do the Moroccans get along with the Spaniards, and how do they get along with the Egyptians, right? And how do they get along with the Canadians? And everybody has different concepts of conflict resolution and time management and resource management. So it's a blessing to see the mosaic of the kingdom of God working together, but it does also bring certain challenges of interpersonal relationship, team management.
Yeah. And being that one of the biggest attrition rates is team conflict, I mean, this just, levels that up even harder.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. And that's the biggest reason people leave the field is interpersonal conflict.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's just room for a lot of joy, potentially a lot of joy, and a lot of just as the Church of God, Christ's church gathers and works with one another and interacts. I think given a lot of grace and humility in the team, if that's the attitude that's being fostered, I just see a tremendous potential on that team.
Yeah. I think the advantage, there's a lot of advantages of a multicultural team. It does take extra work. It takes extra intentionality, but I think the reward, there's a lot of payoffs. One of them is, I think, increased humility among the team members. And at least in Avant, we have seen humility is a key, I don't want to say indicator is not the right word, but like a key ingredient of success as a team. You're a lot more likely to survive as a team and also be successful in your ministry if you've cultivated this, attitude of humility.
Yeah. Jesus was right.
Yeah.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
So as you're recruiting missionaries today, obviously the world's changed a lot, and we hear things about people wanting to commit to shorter projects, not necessarily, not the lifetime call sort of thing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. That's right. The movement among young people now is short-term commitment. Most people want to go for anywhere from a couple weeks, our traditional short-term mission trip, like your church might do, to something maybe like 1 or 2 years.
Yeah.
And in Avant, we're trying to, more recently, just in the last couple of years, we've tried to accommodate that into our system because we see that as a recruitment avenue. If somebody's willing to spend a year on the field, they're more likely to come back for a long-term commitment. But it's challenging. In a year, you can't really learn a local language. How much work can you do on the ground actually in a year? Your understanding of the culture is still pretty limited after a year. So, but that's definitely true. What you said is people are interested in short-term opportunities. They're also not interested typically in traditional mission kind of things like evangelism and church planting. The shift now is more towards social service, what we might call social justice programs, or just cross-cultural experience. They want to just know what it's like living in another culture. But I have heard, I don't know this firsthand, but I've heard some of the, mission fairs and stuff have shifted their emphasis away from typical like church planting and evangelism strategies to more kind of social programs and social service stuff. But everything that I've heard kind of indicates that, this generation of people now in their 20s and 30s, that's what they're interested in.
Yeah. So then that means the agencies, some of it's good and some of it's kind of like, how do we do long-term with this mentality? Because long-term is still necessary for the gospel, but there is some benefit to short-term. So it's this juggle, right?
It's a juggle. It's a juggle. You don't want to say no to the short-term people, because some of them will become long-term people. They'll commit to a long-term endeavor. Yeah, I think mission agencies are trying to figure that out, what to do, because the reality is, if you're going to have an impact in a country, you've got to be there for at least 5 years. I mean, it's going to take you 5 years to at least get fluency, like preaching fluency in that language. And then to understand the culture well enough, build relationships, you got to be there at least 5 years. And I'd say your work's only getting started, at that point.
Oh, yeah.
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 For sure.
And we have more and more what we refer to as restricted access countries too. So talk a little bit about how you're working with that kind of scenario.
Right. That's a really good question, because that's one of the things that has changed, in the last generation or two, is it's just getting harder to get religious visas in a lot of the countries in the world. There's various reasons for that. The biggest one is there's just a movement towards what we call nationalism. A lot of countries are kind of closing their borders to foreigners. So this is kind of the $64 million question, is how do we send people to countries like Vietnam and India and China, and, especially surveillance states like China is really hard to get people into, even on a business visa or something. But that's the avenue, Steve, as you mentioned it, this idea of what's called BAM, business as missions, or B4T, business for transformation. This has kind of been seen as the silver bullet. I'm not quite as optimistic about it. I think it's a good idea, but it comes with its own package of challenges. But there's a lot of energy right now behind business as missions, and it certainly can be successful. We have a very successful church in Vietnam that was grown as a business for missions endeavor, and it certainly has capability. But this visa situation is hard. You asked a question about recruitment, and this actually comes back to the issue of recruitment, because if you're going to go and do a BAM project in a foreign country, you have to have some skills.
Yeah.
And the problem that we're finding, I think, at least in our recruitment, is a lot of young people that go might have a Bible college degree in Bible or something, but they don't have a marketable skill. So it's really hard to get them a work visa in another country. Like, I can't get somebody into Vietnam as an accountant if they don't have an accounting degree, or they're not licensed accountant. So we actually need people now who have marketable skills to reach the unreached. It's not enough to just love Jesus and have a Bible anymore. You actually have to have a skill so you can get a visa so that you can stay in this country and share the gospel.
Yeah. And I think that also brings back, you said that people are going less prepared. I mean, they're less theologically prepared sometimes and missiologically prepared, but they also need to have a skill set that's a marketable skill set. So it's like, how do you have time and energy to train in all those ways and raise support and go? And it's just like, it creates this huge, and people don't want to train for that long before they leave.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's this whole conundrum.
It is, but it's a different world. This comes back to the first question you asked about how is the world different. We had a couple that wanted to come to India, and we asked them. I'm very happy. I would love to see them come, but I wanted them to think about it. And I said, "What are you offering that an Indian can't do already?" Because we have 200 accredited evangelical Bible schools in India. The accreditor, the secretary of the accrediting agency, is a family friend of ours. So we were talking with them a while back. And at that time, there was about 185 schools. It's a little higher now. So, you might have a mission couple, a couple from Moody or something that wants to come work in India. But every Indian doing ministry here already has a master's degree. They have an MDiv or a THM. Some of them have, DMins and stuff. So like, what are you offering? So it's a different world now, where the missionaries coming from the West or the global North, the bar's a lot higher. We're not going to the jungles anymore. We're actually going to very educated people. Like here in India, people are highly educated. Vietnam, people are pretty highly educated if you're going to the cities. So now if you want them to respect you, you also have to have education and skills. So the bar actually for who we're sending is quite a bit higher.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What about the whole scenario where you have a boomer couple where they've retired or about to retire, they have a skill, but they're not going to go long term. There's grandkids and everyone back home. How do they fit into the recruitment picture?
Yeah. So we actually have a couple working in Thailand who fits in there. They're in their early 60s. He's retired military. They wanted to spend their golden years serving abroad, and so they're not in a long-term project. They're not actually part of a team. They started out working in a school, and they've kind of done some other projects since then. But I think those older people are very valuable. And I think our agency sees them that way because they bring a lot of life experience and probably some maturity that some of our younger, team members don't have. So some problem solving abilities, some conflict management, they've seen a lot more of life. And so I think even having somebody like that on a team for a short period of time can bring some stability and wisdom to the team that it might not otherwise have. So I think as an agency, we love people like that.
Yeah. It's challenging though to say the goodbyes, go learn a language, kind of start life all over at that age.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that there aren't as many takers as you might like.
No, we don't have many. We don't have many that are starting out, at the latter end of their work life. Yeah.
But I mean,
the vast
it's an area to grow in, perhaps awareness in the church.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Every time I go speak at a church, I challenge the older people, the retirees. I'm like, your life's not over yet. You still got 20 years left of time you can put in. The problem for older people is they're settled.
Yeah.
They're settled, and it's hard for them for all the same reasons you mentioned. It's hard for them to imagine giving up, like selling their home, leaving their grandkids. It's just a big hurdle.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, we've talked about how missions is shifting, and then now the global South is being much more involved in sending missionaries. Can you talk to us about what are the ways that the global South needs to be more equipped as they send their missionaries?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it depends on the agency and it depends on the country as to how well structured it is. But in general, from what I've seen, is missionaries going out from the lot of training. They may not have a lot of formal education, but they don't have a lot of and they may also not have a lot of cross-cultural experience. So that's actually something I didn't really think about until we started working with a pretty multinational group of people. But in the US and even more so in Canada and perhaps even more so than in Europe, like we at least have an awareness of working with other cultures. Like we're taught, okay, don't look at people that are different than you, don't stare at them, don't make fun of them, right? So there's actually there's kind of a certain assumption we have as North Americans and Europeans and Australians about how we relate to other cultures. But that base level of knowledge doesn't exist in a lot of other places in the world because they don't have to. That's not part of their cultural toolbox. They haven't had to interact with other people cross-culturally. So some of our folks from the global South have struggled with cultural adaptation, more so than North Americans. And again, there's a lot of personality involved here. It's hard to quantify that. But I would say in general, the folks that we have from the global South have struggled more. And I think a lot of that has to do with they're just not as prepared for it as somebody from the global North.
Yeah. I think of one example of that. I love Brazil. I grew up in Brazil as a missionary kid. Brazilians are very, like, their diet, their food is always this, like, there's one way to eat, and this, very standardized. And there's not a whole lot of different ethnic cuisines. And so, here in the US, we'll eat just about from every country in the world. If you go in Portland, you go to food carts, you can get, 100 different kinds of food.
Yeah.
Whereas they're just used to their own food. And so when they go, Brazil is sending hundreds of missionaries, and some ways they're incredibly effective. But that whole idea of cultural adaptation has been a struggle, especially in the area of food, because they just aren't even exposed to different foods. So that's one area I've seen play out.
Yeah, and food speaks so much of home. And so when you can't find the food that you're used to, or your team doesn't value what you value anyway, I'm sure. Something else that we've run into in some interviews is just as people get sort of settled in a country, but then you have the whole, I can still communicate, I can FaceTime, I can communicate back home. So talk about getting settled in ministry where you can still reach out to the folks back home and maybe not develop those ties in your host country.
Yeah, so I think that is, anybody, this is very much personality related, I think, as I've watched it. So you kind of have sort of two extremes. You have your very outgoing kinds of like people that aren't afraid. I know this guy in the Middle East, he's one of our workers there, and he just isn't afraid to speak Arabic incorrectly at all. He'll go out there and he'll just talk to people, and he's not afraid, if they don't understand him or anything. He's just not shy about it. Then there's other in Spanish. It was like, I don't want to see anybody. I don't want to talk to anybody. I'm going to go hide in my house. And so that certainly is a possibility where, you can get to the field, and usually after it's about the first 3 weeks, the honeymoon starts wearing off. But then after a couple months, it starts getting difficult. And after about 6 months, you've kind of decided whether you're going to like it or not. And, if after about 6 months, you start pulling back and you don't want to go outside, you don't want to go shopping, you don't want to have to go ask people how much does it cost. And that's a sign of trouble. And it certainly happens. We had one lady who I was surprised, actually, because she was very outgoing. She was a very big people person. But when she moved to her country to learn the language there, she all of a sudden became very introverted. She didn't want to leave her room. She didn't want to talk to anybody. She was afraid of failing. And it really caught me by surprise. But it's very true. And I don't think there's a cure for it. It's like sometimes you have to just step out for a minute and maybe come back with renewed energy, or you got to power through it and be like, okay, I'm just gonna learn this language, and I'm gonna. Culture can do the same thing. I had one of our good friends here in Asia, one of our coworkers, he'd been in his host country for about 5 years, and was just starting to burn out because of the culture was rubbing him the wrong way. And he just needed to get out for a while, take a break, go back to the US with his family, take a breather, and come back at it. And he's doing a lot better, but he just needed to step out. It was just, he had a little too much of the host culture. It was too much every day.
Language and culture learning. There's nothing harder. There's nothing more challenging than that. So it takes some perseverance for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us some good news. Tell us some stories, some things that are going well, things that you're seeing that are encouraging to you.
Absolutely. So I think, gosh, there's so much to be amazed about. I think one of them, Cara, you mentioned Brazil, right? I go around when I talk with people about missions, I'll always ask them, what's the biggest mission sending country other than the United States? And usually people say South Korea, but it's actually Brazil.
Hmm.
Brazil now for maybe about a decade has been the largest mission sending country other than the US. Um, that's amazing. I mean, Brazil sent like 40,000 missionaries
Wow.
in 2021 or 20, somewhere around there. I think is what the number is. 40,000 missionaries. That's amazing for a country that still has dire poverty and political instability and its own huge unreached people group areas, right? I mean, that's really an amazing accomplishment. Um, for for me personally, just a couple of stories from our region. One of the ladies, I think I mentioned her already, from Ecuador, her group of people was evangelized by our mission agency and other mission agencies. I mean, she wasn't born yet, but her ancestors were. And now she's in the Philippines and she's planting a church
Hmm.
in the middle section of the Philippines. And I think that's amazing. 100 years, not even 100 years, 70 years has gone by, two generations. And these churches have now sent a missionary to the Philippines and is working with a Filipino team to plant a church in Iloilo. That's amazing. We have another team we're very proud of in Vietnam, and they went as a business as missions endeavor. They all worked with this international company. It was hard. They learned a lot through it. They made mistakes. But in the process, a Vietnamese lady came to Christ and she wanted to share her faith with other Vietnamese. So she started a TikTok channel and she reached literally thousands of Vietnamese. I don't know how many followers she had on her TikTok channel. But there was enough in their city that they were able to plant a church. And the church is now about 2.5 years old. It's almost entirely new believers. And it was all done through this TikTok channel
Hmm.
that just amazing. So the church has now, I think, on a Sunday, maybe 30 or 40 regular attendees on a
Hmm.
Sunday, and
Hmm.
they're probably baptizing 2 or 3 people every few months. So
Hmm.
they've got an indigenous pastor, local Vietnamese guy who trained at the seminary there, and they're talking about how do we wind ourselves out of this. So we talk about working ourselves out of a job,
Yeah.
and they're starting to have discussions about how do we unwind our involvement here in this church.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. I think it's easy at times to focus on the struggles and the
Mhm.
heartache and the challenges. I mean, those are real. We need to talk about those, but we also need to recognize that God isn't limited by all these things and he is still doing his work and growing
Absolutely.
his church.
Yeah. There's real challenges, and I talk with my VP about this a lot. I'm like, we need to address these challenges. And because there are challenges, there's some we can solve and some we can't. But you're right. We often overlook what has been accomplished in the global missions movement. I mean, just in the last, gosh, you could just say in the last decade, but I'm thinking about like everything we've accomplished in the last 140 years. Avant started in 1892. And I'm thinking about all that like we've done in since 1892. It's just awesome. It's amazing. And how many people have been sent? How many churches have been established? The fact that we have 200 Bible schools in India,
Hmm.
evangelical accredited Bible schools. There's more that aren't evangelical, more that aren't accredited.
Hmm.
But that's a result of the men and women who literally sacrificed lives, money, children, um, yeah, they sacrifice it so that now we have these schools here that are training up church planters and pastors in India. Um, it's awesome. It's amazing to see what's been accomplished.
Yeah, and I would guess that most would not think that that's happening in India. I mean, you look from the outside looking in, you don't think, wow,
Yeah.
there's 200
Yeah.
accredited Bible teaching schools.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Right.
so we have a very global podcast audience in like 102 countries, and we're really wanting to encourage and equip the global church in the Great Commission. What would you say would be an encouragement and challenge to our very global audience of kind of this next phase of missions?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. I think it is an encouragement, kind of what we were just talking about, is seeing the successes, that it is costly to do this. I mean, financially, of course, it's very expensive, to fund missionaries. Even missionaries from the global south, it's still expensive. People literally sacrifice. I mean, obviously, there's people who die on the mission field, although it's less now than it used to be. But it's still dangerous. Like, we have people get in. Like, I drive into the city every day, about 3 times a week, and it's incredibly dangerous to drive in the city I live in. So there are there are dangers. People put their children at risk, but all of that is worth something. Like, this wasn't for naught, right? The people who have sacrificed, amazing things have been accomplished. And I think that's an encouragement. We're seeing missionaries going out from places like Brazil, 40,000 missionaries from Brazil. India is, I think, it's in the top 10. It might be the number 5 mission sending country. The Philippines is right there, like number 4, somewhere in that. So, like, that's amazing. That's amazing that Filipinos are going out around the world, that Indians are going around the world, Brazilians are going out around the world. That's a serious encouragement. And that means the work we're doing is worthwhile. I think there's challenges, and I think the challenges are, have to be addressed too for us to be more successful. I'm going to be going to the Luzon 4 conference here in South Korea in about a month, about 3 weeks from now. And that in itself, I think, is amazing. We're going to have something like 5,000, people involved in missions from around the world gathered in Incheon, and that's amazing. But there are real challenges, and so the point of this Luzon 4 gathering is to what do they call it? Like, fill the gaps. Like, what are the gaps still in the Great Commission that need to be filled? What are the people that need to be reached? What are the doors that need to be opened? What are the methodologies that need to be used? So this is kind of like, okay, we've come this far. What do we need to do to go further? And I think this is a good time to ask that. We started the conversation talking about globalization. And if you talk to economists and you talk to sociologists, global sociologists, the era of globalization is coming to an end. We're entering a new era of global history. The era of free trade is coming to an end. The era of open borders is coming to an end. So we're entering a new political reality in the world, a new economic reality. China has the 2nd largest GDP in the world. India has the 5th largest. These are actually becoming wealthy countries now. My neighbors all around me, and I live in a fairly poor part of town, but my neighbors next door to me and across the street make more money than I do, right? So, they might look at me and say, oh, he's the white guy across the street, but I know that they make a lot more money than I do. That's the reality, right? That's the world we're going into. So the challenges are things like, how do we balance funding of missionaries when we have this is a discussion we're having right now in our mission agency. When we have a multinational team, how do we make sure that everybody's salary is, one, fair, like sort of equal, but then also what everybody can raise from their own country? Right? So we can't set the salary of everybody at the salary of the Hondurans or whoever, and we can't set the Honduran salary at the American salary. So we have to figure these questions out in order to have good teams. Another challenge is theology. That all around the world, prosperity gospel has, whether it's in Africa, Asia, North America, prosperity gospel is kind of the thing right now. And that has been very destructive, I think, for ministry in a lot of places in the world. And how we deal with that has to be considered. And that's a hard question. And what is prosperity gospel, and these kinds of things. But it has to be dealt with somehow. We need healthy churches. And I would say is the third thing is, especially for global South partners, brothers and sisters, a lot of the cultures that our teammates are coming out of, our coworkers are coming out of, have unhealthy leadership practices, an unhealthy conflict resolution, and unhealthy communication styles, whether it's Latin America, Middle East, Asia. So authoritarianism is kind of what people defer to. Again, in all of those places, the natural default of a leader is to be authoritarian. And helping, I think, our Global South partners to see better ways of doing leadership and do leadership in healthier ways is a challenge. So I think those are some of the things we face in the future, is training leaders from the Global South with healthy leadership skills, healthy communication, healthy conflict resolution. The funding question is a big one. And then how we tackle things like theology. When we lived in the Philippines, one of the interesting things to me is that the second largest church in the Philippines after the Catholic Church is actually a cult. Wow. The Iglesia Ni Cristo. And it is it's large, it's prolific, they're all over in the Philippines, and it only started maybe 60 or 70 years ago, maybe not even that long. So I'm like, how on earth? Like, we've been sending missionaries to the Philippines for a long, long time. How did this cult become so big and so prolific in the Philippines? And there's reasons for it that we don't need to get into, but those are the challenges we face.
Sending out missionaries from all these different contexts, working well as team, and preaching the real gospel. Sounds like those are no small tasks.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we always want to equip our listeners. So if there's any books or websites or anything that you would encourage someone to read about, listen to, podcasts maybe about global trends and missions, do you have any recommendations?
Sure. I would say just one resource tool is the Missio Nexus website. I mean, Missio Nexus is a huge partnership of different agencies, and they're very active. They have a lot of tons of resources that probably anybody could find useful. So that would be the first one, Missio Nexus. Then the Luzon just published their Great Commission report. And you can just go to the Luzon website, and there's a tool at the bottom that allows you to explore the report. They've got a ton of well-done graphics, and you can download them. You can use them for presentations and stuff like that. It's a very readable, easy-to-use tool. It's divided up in different segments and subsegments. So that would be the other thing, the Great Commission report from Luzon. It just came out maybe 3 months ago.
Oh, wow. Very accurate and up to date.
Yeah, pretty up to date. It's pretty up to date.
Great. Well, I think it's just really helpful to for us to wrap our heads around, missions is changing. And it'd be interesting to see, 5 years from now, kind of this trend as it shifts, kind of what this new era looks like. And it'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, it's a new world. I think it's a very new world, but at every turn of history, God has raised up a generation of people, and this generation that He's raising up is going to be multinational. I think we all recognize that. But He's going to be raising up people from countries that are equipped for these new challenges.
Yeah.
This young Vietnamese girl who started a church on TikTok. These are the people that God's going to use.
Yeah.
Right. So, there's always a new challenge, right? We had World War I, and then we had the Depression, and we had World War II, and we had, the 60s and 70s, which was actually all around the world, everything that brought. And, we have globalization now that's coming to an end. This new era, God will have a group of people to be used for it, and they're going to do an amazing work.
Yeah. God's not done. He's got a
No.
plan.
He's got a plan.
Great. Well, thanks so much for talking with us today and sharing from your experience and your wisdom. So, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It was a joy. Thank you for having me.
Cara, talk to me about this conversation with Eric. What stood out to you?
Yeah, so I'm fascinated about how the world has been changing, and missions is obviously a part of that global world, and how globalization has affected missions. And then now, as he mentioned, this kind of shift into perhaps a new era of missions and what that looks like. I'm just really curious to see how that all unfolds.
I was really struck as he was talking about the multinational teams, and we had a conversation about that, but just the trying to create the equity on the team, and that, so that people feel cared for equally, that they have what they need, that everyone can live and survive and thrive in their host country. But they have different, resources back home. And so how do you balance that out?
Yeah, I think there's just clear in this conversation that there's still a lot of challenges, but also God is at work. Like, there's no, I mean, we can see the barriers, but God has a plan. So
yeah,
that was
and just
really encouraging.
Just to hear the people going from everywhere to everywhere, and that's where we are right now.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to you joining us next time.
Thank you for joining us for the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, or maybe the podcast you heard today, you've been prompted to pass this along to someone you know that could benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy lives to help us learn more about missionary care.
We want to thank Tim Downing for the music he wrote and performed for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can find out more about Tim at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos, and our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Githens, my amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website to see more of Micah's great work at sanctuaryinn.org.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.